You know what we haven't done in forever? A proper, out-of-a-box, nerd-filled bike build. Now, if you go back to old videos of mine that have tons and tons of views where I've just kind of thrown bikes together out of boxes, then you'll see comments that criticize doing that. Comments that kind of make fun of me saying, let's put this bike together and then just like throw the front wheel on, which you know in reality is exactly what I did. In a lot of cases when I'm putting a new bike together for a video, I'll just throw it together purely for video's sake. Hardly the right way to do it. No matter how tempting it is to just bolt on those last few pieces, the last mile of assembly, if you will. Before any more real assembly happens beyond maybe putting the bars on, for most bikes it's worth doing a little bit of disassembly first. Now it might seem a little bit unnecessary to pull the fork out, but I do like to check the headset bearings to see what kind of grease we're dealing with. Now this bike does have some light grease all over the bearings, which is nice to see, but it's light enough that after a few rides in the rain or, you know, in our cold, wet, gross climate, I would expect that this very light grease would sort of wash away fairly quickly, basically just not stand the test of time. So as an immediate form of preventative maintenance, I like to put on some nice, thicker, industrial strength stuff that's just gonna basically be set and forget. It doesn't need a ton, just enough to keep things slippery, and this stuff has proven to last through all sorts of weather conditions and not really getting me in trouble. So that takes care of one of the usual suspects for undergreased creaking madness later on in the life of a new bike that was assembled far too quickly. Obviously I'm leaning down here for a reason. The second lies in here, the bottom bracket. Now looking at this, I can see the light Shimano grease is kind of coming out of where I would hope that it would be. And that's to be expected because it's all shipped ready to do that. Now, what I'd be curious about, because a lot of manufacturers don't do it, is whether or not the bottom bracket itself threaded into the frame dry or whether or not there was some sort of lubrication in there. In a dry climate, if the bike never saw a wet day of its life, that would never be an issue. But this tends to be a spot of creaking and annoyance fairly early on in a ungreased bottom bracket bike life. In a bike's ungreased bottom bracket life. At least that's been my experience. One of the worst culprits for this, and you could always tell if someone in the shop didn't take the time to take the bike apart to do all this stuff, was Specialized Cirruses. They always came back to the shop with wildly creaky bottom brackets if they weren't taken apart and properly greased and put back together to the appropriate torque specs. I mean, it was always a quick fix, but it was just something you should deal with and not be lazy about at the beginning. That's that Shimano grease I was talking about. Again, there's some light grease in there. Probably would have been fine, but worth adding just a little bit more. But it is nice to see some in there. Usually there isn't. And remember way back when I was building Brent's bike, I'm pretty sure, this little like compression nut that goes on Shimano cranks does not need to be tight. 2 foot-pounds, like it's just a little bit more than finger tight. The spindles on Shimano cranks aren't stepped in any way to keep you from preloading bearings, so you need to be very careful to not over tighten this, or else you're putting too much tension on the inner races of the bearing where the outer races stay put, which increases friction, and more importantly, very detrimentally decreases the lifespan of your bottom bracket bearings. So, you don't want them too tight. I think it's also probably worth noting that if you've got anything other than a threaded bottom bracket like we have here, Square Taper, Shimano GXP from SRAM, If you've got those, worthwhile doing. A lot of times maybe there's some grease in there, maybe there isn't, so it's a bit of a toss-up. You won't know until you look. But if you've got press fit anything, just leave it alone. It's gonna creak anyway, so live with the decision you made to buy a press fit bottom bracket bike. So you'd be forgiven for thinking we took some stuff apart, now it's time to throw this front wheel on. But no, that's not the case. I wouldn't recommend doing that at all, considering machine-built wheels typically leave a little bit to be desired in the world of even tension. Their end goal is exact trueness. A machine doesn't really have much problem with throwing some extra tension somewhere where it needs it to get it there, or pulling some out to do what it needs to get it there, which in turn produces a very nice round true wheel until you ride it. And that's why if you've ever ridden a new bike or a new wheel or anything that hasn't been stress relieved or had its tension sort of evenly distributed, you'll start hearing these pops and cracks, which probably will happen when you try and stress relieve this a little bit, which I just grab groups of 4 spokes and just press them together the same way that I would when I'm building a wheel. A lot of times these wheels don't go through a spoke bedding process. They don't go through the process of getting their tension relieved. They don't go through a process of having someone actually go over them to make sure that the tension is as equal as you can get it and as true as you can for those tensions. It is not always a clear benefit to put all of your efforts toward complete trueness and neglect all other factors that make for a good, strong, long-lasting wheel. I'm going to assume this one was probably hurt in shipping. You wouldn't always see them show up this way. Also at this point, with the wheels off, equally as important, good opportunity to take your dork disc off. And well, I know that legally speaking, you're probably supposed to have these, and that a bike shop should probably leave them on. Take them off. There's generally a good way of taking reflectors off, like, you know, pushing on this and blah blah blah. Well, there, that came off not bad. But I kind of prefer the like breaking it off method. It's just a lot faster. Now, depending on what kind of wheels you have, this could be a really good opportunity to check your bearing preload. These use a sealed bearing. Showing you this really doesn't help all that much, but you know, with a loose ball, cone, and nut and ball bearing hub, a lot of times the bearing preload is actually harder than it needs to be. What you're looking for is like the tiniest, minute amount of play when it's not in the wheel, so that when the quick release closes, it adds the proper preload so that the wheel will spin without any sort of added friction or added wear for that matter. But sealed bearing, don't have to do anything, just leave them be. If you're curious on how to do that, you're probably watching the wrong channel. I'm a very poor teacher. Okay, headset's greased, bottom bracket is serviced, wheels taken off, adjusted, and made sure they're running. Wheels removed, tires removed, made sure that they are running true and properly tensioned. Now, it would be very tempting right now to just start tuning the drivetrain and the brakes. And then, interestingly enough, actually, Schwinn didn't ship this with, I'm looking at it here. Schwinn didn't ship this with bar tape on it, which I love. I'm actually excited about, for the reason that all this extra cable is here. Now, this isn't necessary. You don't have to do this. All this extra cable here doesn't impede the performance of the drivetrain or the brakes. It does look fairly ungodly, and I do hate it. I'm gonna do what I can to shorten this entire mess of cables. So in my opinion, the next important thing to do is just to make sure that you're happy with where the bars are with the levers on it. Okay, now we can tune it. Which I already did before starting this clip, and now normally the bike would be done, but Schwinn sent it without bar tape on it, which, like I said, I do like, but now it becomes the last step instead of the no step at all. I do like wrapping bar tape! Whew, that would have sucked if that cut that. So there you have it, a proper bike assembly from start to finish. Out of the box, ready for a set of pedals and riding without any sort of problems in the foreseeable future. Now I can understand the question that's probably going through your head right now, like what's the difference? Like why would doing all this, taking it all apart and taking the time to make sure that the wheels are true and making sure that, you know, things are greased and all that, like why? What is the difference? Why wouldn't I just throw the front wheel on, put the handlebars in the stem, check the shifting and go for it? And I mean, that's fair. I've done that to a bunch of bikes. I've pulled bikes out of boxes and taken them for rides. And there's nothing unsafe about it. You're not going to hurt anything. But honestly, the biggest benefit of going through it when it comes out of the box and doing all of this before it ever gets ridden is it makes all those problems that new bikes have just kind of not exist. So yeah, you can throw a bike together out of the box immediately. It's not the proper way, it's not the right way, but it doesn't mean that the bike's not rideable. You totally can ride it out of the box. It just means that you're accelerating your first trip to a bike stand. That's all. I'd love to go ride this right now, but it is getting late, so I'm gonna go away. Okay.